I'm Baelin Halon, and this is Building Basics with Gurreck Clan. Very common question that we tend to get a lot of times is, where do I start? We always say start at the beginning. Start with your tools. Before you can build your armor or build a costume, you've got to have some tools. So let's talk about basic tools. What are the basics that you can use to build armor? And then we can expand from there. So the first thing that we've got to talk about whenever we talk about tools is we do have to talk about safety. So let's get into, before we get into anything else, let's talk about personal protective equipment. Starting with protecting one of the most important assets you're going to have in your entire life is your lungs. As we're all very aware right now, lungs are very precious, so we need to protect them. So you need to have some form of breath protection in the form of a mask. Now you can go as simple as a homemade or store-bought cloth mask. In this case, this one's denim and duck cloth, made it myself. A lot of us have become very adept at making these recently. 95% of the stuff that you're going to be working with in building Mandalorian armor can be blocked out with this. This will block out all the dust from sanding. This will block out the dust from using a Dremel. This will take care of you. When it comes to painting, it will stop the particulates. It will not stop the vapor. So keep that in mind. Moving up from that, if you have the ability to get them, a good, true, high-end or higher-end dust mask. Again, this will block out particulates. This will protect you from the vast majority of the things that we do when it comes to actually building the armor. But again, this is not rated for vapor. Vapor is an important thing to talk about when we get into later aspects of building, such as painting. When you're painting, you're dealing with chemical fumes. If you have to strip paint off for any reason, you're dealing with chemical fumes. When you're heating things like Sintra or even some ABS or other plastics, they can release fumes, they can release vapors. That's where an actual R-rated respirator comes into play. These are rated for blocking vapors and protecting your lungs from things like that. Not just particulates, but the vapor as well. Because the vapor is what's going to give you the really bad headache, the real big nausea, and who knows what else it's going to do to your lungs. So take the time, invest in your proper protective equipment for your lungs, because we want to have you around trooping with us for a long time. After your lungs, let's talk about your eyes. Eye protection comes in numerous ways, numerous shapes. It only comes in one way to protect your eyes. If it doesn't protect your eyes, it's not eye protection. That's stupid. So, eye protection. Different colors. They come in different sizes. The big thing you want to do is make sure it fits your head and that it covers your eyes. Nothing sucks worse, trust me, than when you're sanding away and something pops you in the eyeball, and best case scenario, you get some grit in your eye and you go flush your eyes out and you're okay. Worst case scenario, you can lose your eye. These are not expensive. None of this personal protective equipment has to break the bank. You can get it at places like Harbor Freight, Home Depot, Lowe's, Ace Hardware, your local big box hardware store. You can even get some of it at Walmart or Kmart, and it doesn't have to cost a lot. Some of the eye protection I pick up for $1. When my local hardware store has a sale, I stock up on eye protection. I stock up on things like ear protection. Protect your ears, protect your hearing. Make sure you can listen to your friends and family talk about how awesome your armor is. Protect your ears. You work with certain power tools, if they get bound up, they can make some awful sounds that will hurt your ears and leave them ringing. Protect your ears. And finally, gloves. Get some good leather gloves. Again, they don't have to cost a fortune. Everybody has seen these. These are good old yard gloves. Leather palm, leather fingers. The reason for these is when you start dealing with shaping your armor, dealing with shaping Sintra, shaping your ABS, your HDPE, or whatever you're dealing with, you're going to be dealing with very high temperatures. You don't want to touch it with your pitties. That will hurt. That will leave blisters. That will leave scars. That can cause all kinds of bad things to happen. Put on some leather gloves and your hands are now protected and you can do your job. And finally, my wife always makes me talk about protect your clothes. Get an apron, get a shop coat, get a lab coat, or get some crappy clothes that you don't care what happens to, but that's your shop clothes. That protects your clothing and your wardrobe and your finances as well. So that's personal protective equipment. There are other things that you can get depending on the tools that you're using, but again, this is basics. Get those basic items because those basic items will keep you living longer, living happier, and in a lot less irritation. So let's talk about moving on to the next set of basic tools. Most important basic tool to me is, as long as I have this, I can start making armor, and that is my razor knife, also known as a box cutter. Numerous different names for it. They come in multiple different sizes, shapes, blade types. This particular one happens to be one of my favorites. It ratchets out. You can get a big old knife. You don't need to have it out that far when you're cutting your armor. Doing that, I don't know how it will show up, but there's little segments in that where you can snap off the tip as it dulls down. That's it. That's how much you need to cut through. You're not trying to go through in one pass when you're cutting Sintra, even 6mm Sintra. You're not cutting through in one pass. This is all you need. If this is all you have, you can still make armor. With this, you can cut out your armor if you're using Sintra or certain other plastics. You can bevel your edges. If this is all you have, this is what you can do. This is the most basic tool we've got. And if you have one, again, you can build your armor. They are not expensive. You can get them as cheap, in some cases, as 50 cents. Got it 50 cents at the checkout of a local hardware store. Again, same thing, very long blade, the little segments on there so I can break off the tip. As, again, you don't need very much as you're cutting through. The reason I like this is the blades are, as I said, you can break off the tip of the blade so that you always have a sharp point going into your Sintra as need be. These are sharpenable if you have a sharpener. They're also, the blades are cheap and easy to replace. Helpful hint number one when it comes to these is most of these have on the back of a little cap that locks the blade in that keeps it in the handle. There's a little slot on the back of that handle. That's what you use to break off the tip. Don't try using your hands because you'll lose your fingers. You can use pliers if necessary, but they put the little thing in there for a reason. Okay, razor knife, box cutter, by any other name, it's still what's going to be probably your most used tool to cut out your Sintra. I'm going to continue to refer to Sintra because that's what I build my armor out of. That's what 90% of us use. Other materials, again, they're just as usable with these tools. Clamps. You will use clamps throughout your armor build, whether you're using it to hold things in place as glue is setting or glue is drying, or if you're using it to hold shapes, or if you're using it to hold your work down on a workbench or to a piece of wood or whatever, you're going to use clamps. They come in many different styles, whether it's the big C, a higher end or a higher grip, spring, or even a bar clamp. And they come in different sizes. Get the size that you need. Again, none of these have to break the bank. I got this for $2 at a Harbor Freight. And again, you wait for sales. Keep an eye on your mail. Look at your local circulars to see what's going on sale. You can pick them up at Walmart. You can pick them up in some automotive stores. These all come in handy. Tape measure. You want to measure things. You need a tape measure. Sometimes they flop around. That doesn't matter. Now, this is not the tape measure you're going to use when you're trying to measure your arms or measure, around. Use the tailor's tape for that. We'll talk about, I think we've talked about it in another series, and we'll talk about it again later. But this is when you're going to be measuring out your Sintra and figuring out your square footage so that you know where to put your templates. Comes in handy. I've had that particular tape measure for almost 30 years. Hot glue gun and hot glue. Different people have different opinions on it, whether you use it for something permanent or something temporary. There are times hot glue gun will save your life. Okay, maybe that's a stretch, but it will save your costume and it will save your sanity. It's also something I recommend keeping in a crash kit, something we'll talk about in a later video, because they can be used to make quick repairs. An underrated tool in the toolbox. The Sharpie, the permanent marker. Whether you're using it to mark out your templates on Centra, whether you're using it to keep an eye on where you need to make darts or whatever for a complex curve, if you're using it to identify where you're going to attach, put screw holes or anything like that, the Sharpie, I recommend buying a big box of them and keeping them on hand. In multiple different colors, especially if you're going to use black Centra, use a silver Sharpie. Black will show up at certain angles, but it's not always as convenient as you would like it to be. So next thing I want to talk about is sandpaper. Sandpaper is exactly what it is. It sounds like it's sand or grit attached to paper that you use to polish. The whole point of sandpaper is it polishes out your material. Now that polish, not necessarily what you think. It's not always about making it shiny. It's about removing material. So you can have everything from a 320 grit, which removes very little material, but it will actually put what we would call a shine on certain things, all the way down to 80 grit. 80 grit, and let's talk about grit. So 80 grit. You generally don't want to go any lower than this. What grit refers to is the number of grains or granules per square inch. Okay, so 80 grit sandpaper is really coarse. You can hear that because it's got 80 grains per square inch is what it's rated at. And this will remove material quick and in a hurry. 40 grit, for example, or 60 grit, if you go that low, we're talking some massive, coarse sandpaper that will remove material very quickly. It will also gouge your material, your Centra, or your whatever you're using. It's going to gouge it. So that's when you move up from your 80 grit, you move up to things like 100 grit, 220 grit, and again, as you go, the higher the grit, the more grains it has and you can hear that change as it goes to a higher grit. It gets smoother and smoother. When you start getting into things like 1,000 grit or 2,000 grit, or I've even used one that was rated in microns, that's when you're talking about truly doing a mirror shine. Now, we're typically not going to be doing things like that. For building my Mando armor, I've never gone above 320 grit, but those all come in different aspects for working through your material, whether you're using it to shape, to bevel, or to clean up imperfections, or even using it for weathering. 80 grit comes in fantastic when you're weathering your kit. That leads to ways to use that. You can use a sanding sponge, where you can either buy a sanding sponge that comes in the grit that you're using. You can buy a block where you can attach a strip of sandpaper to it to sand through. You can even use just a regular dishwashing sponge. Wrap your sandpaper around that, and it does the same thing this does. Okay. There's also sanding sticks. Now I know you're sitting there saying to yourself, Baelin, what's a sanding stick? Well, step one is you go to Lowe's, Home Depot, Ace Hardware, Walmart, anywhere that you can get your hands on a paint stick. You normally use it to stir your paint. You take that, you apply a little bit of spray adhesive. Or you can use glue stick if you would prefer. I recommend a low-tack general purpose spray adhesive for this so that you can change it out. But then you lay that down on a piece of sandpaper, and you have now created a sanding stick. And you cut that strip of sandpaper off using the aforementioned razor knife, and you now have a sturdy, easy to use sanding surface that you can use for sanding your armor. This comes in handy when you're doing things like putting a bevel onto armor. Instead of trying to do that by hand, you've got a nice, easy, you can put your bevel on your armor. You can also use it to take imperfections out of plastic. It comes in handy when you're sanding 3D print lines. You got a nice firm surface, but it still has a little bit of give, so it's not going to overpress. You can press and still have some flex. Unless you get crazy and you get one of those really thick paint sticks that don't flex for anything. So, paint sticks or sanding sticks as they become. You can also do the same thing with a dowel rod. You can spray a little adhesive on a dowel rod, various sizes, or even a piece of PVC. Attach that sandpaper to it using the spray adhesive, and now you've got a curved surface again that will come in handy sanding out things like trigger wells or trigger guards, or any curved area that you're doing in your armor that a flat surface is not necessarily what you need. Before I forget, I do have one other low-end tool, and that's super glue. You're going to use super glue to attach things to your Sintra, to your ABS. It's going to stick to almost everything. It also comes in handy if your hand slips and you cut a gouge across your Sintra that you don't want there. Put a little bit of super glue in there. It's going to bond it back up. You can sand it out, and it's going to keep that from opening up and not being the weathering you may have wanted in that particular location. And there you have it. Those are the basics. Those are, with those few items, you can actually sit and make armor. You can start the building process of building your Mandalorian. I'm Baelin Halon, and this is Building Basics with Gurreck Clan.